For the last tutorial of this module, I would like to briefly show you some things about the tiling textures, and for this one I've chosen the wall texture. And as you might remember, we didn't make any UVs for this one, which is because we are just going to use this as a tiling texture, and therefore we're going to later render out, when we're going to the texturing phase, the top view of this tiling texture in ZBrush. What we first need to do is to export the model and the plane we created the model on to ZBrush, and I will see you there. In ZBrush I already have dynameshed my model and I applied the polygroups. Please make sure that you keep the bricks and the plane separate, because later we're going to use the plane to render out the exact dimensions of our tiling texture, and we're going to tile the bricks on top of it. But for now I'm just going to show you a few more sculpting things, and then this will conclude the first module. I'm not going to show you how to sculpt these bricks again, because we've done 2 tutorials on how to sculpt stones. But after I'm done with this, I'm going to show you a few more things, and then it's up to you to sculpt all the high polys of the remaining pieces. Okay, I've already started by sculpting some detail into some of the stones, and I want to show you how you can make a really quick stone texture like the one I've been using here. So let's pick a stone, let's take this one. And I'm going to do a similar thing that I have done to the metal. I'm taking a standard brush, freehand mode, and I'm going to paint some height detail on it, something like this. And then with a trim dynamic brush, I'm going to sculpt this flat. And by doing so, you can see some of the shapes are turning into harder corners and harder edges, and I'm using these as a very subtle detail map for my stone sculpt. Sometimes you see some errors happening like this piece, but I actually like it, so I'm going to keep it in there. And then sometimes I just have to sculpt some edges again, but that's not a lot of work. And this is how quickly you can make a rock texture yourself. Another thing you can do with this is, let's see, which other stone would I like to be textured? This one maybe. We're going to do the same thing. Going to trim this down again. And this time, because I stored a morph target of the previous sculpt, I'm going to sculpt in a little bit of layering. Which I can then trim again, and you get some layering going on in your rocks, like this. But I'm not going to do this for my sculpt. You can do that if you want, of course. But I want to keep my tiling texture a bit cleaner, because any detail you're going to add to it, it's going to be multiplied throughout the scene and might get a bit noisy in the end. Also, I'm not sculpting every stone. I want to see how it looks like if I leave some very flat and only give some of these some detail. I'm now going to do a last iteration on the fine details, and then we're doing another thing that will enhance the texture. Okay, once you've sculpted in some more detail, and I would advise you to be very careful with this since this is a tiling texture, we're going to pick some of these pieces and we're going to rotate them a bit. So with R, you drag a line like this, and then you can rotate the blocks very little, so that it's not all that straight. And I'm going to do that for a few blocks now, and you will see the difference later in the tiling texture. Also, you can rotate them in this angle maybe. And you see already this makes it look a lot more interesting. And as you can see, even though I've only rotated them by just a few degrees, it looks a lot more natural and a lot more interesting to look at than if I kept all these pieces straight. And even though in the end we will only see our texture like this, the information that we'll get on our height map is going to imitate this effect that there's a height difference in here. And the way we're going to paint the shadows and the ambient occlusion will give us a hint that there's some depth to this texture. Just be careful to rotate the pieces at the borders, because this is where the texture is going to tile. And of course at the top and the bottom, even though for this one we're probably only going to use the left and the right side. Now you can repeat this step on the floor texture and on the wood texture if you like. For the next module, I would expect to have all the models UV'd and sculpted, so that we can move on to the texturing and baking parts in the next few lessons. This concludes the module on UVing and sculpting the objects we have modeled in the previous one. In this module, we learned how to UV our models using different techniques, like using directly in Maya or using 3D code to apply new UVs to a model. We've also learned how to add sculpting passes to our low poly models, learning how to sculpt metal, wood, and stone. We have also learned how to export our tileable textures from Maya into ZBrush and add sculpting detail to them later. In the next module, we're going to have a look and take our sculpts, bake them down back to the low poly models, and we're going to start with the painting process. Thank you for choosing 3D Motive, and I'll see you in the next module.